Stephanie St. Clair stood at the barred window of the Women's House of Detention in Greenwich Village, watching the gray January sky dissolve into evening. At 45 years old, she carried herself with the bearing of royalty, even in the coarse prison dress that hung from her slender frame. The other inmates called her Queenie, though never to her face unless invited. She preferred Madame St. Clair, a title she'd earned through a decade of running Harlem's most sophisticated numbers racket, building an empire on pennies and dreams while the white gangsters downtown counted their millions from bootlegging and protection schemes. She had come to America from Martinique in 1912 with $40 sewn into her coat lining and a head full of ambition that wouldn't quit. 20 years later, she employed hundreds, paid police captains and ward bosses, and walked through Harlem like she owned every sidewalk. Dutch Schultz and his Jewish mob had tried to take her operation, offering partnership that sounded like subjugation. She told him what he could do with his offer, using language that would have made a sailor blush. That was 6 months ago. Now she was here, convicted on some trumped-up charge that wouldn't have stuck to a white man for 5 minutes. The day room smelled of industrial soap and bodies pressed too close together. Stephanie sat at a corner table, her back to the wall, watching the social dynamics play out with the clinical interest of someone who'd built a business understanding human nature. The prison operated on the same principles as Harlem: money, respect, and the willingness to defend both. The white women occupied the tables nearest the windows, the best light, the freshest air. The colored women congregated near the doors, ready to move when the guards barked orders. The handful of Italian and Jewish women floated between, their status determined by connections on the outside. Stephanie belonged to none of these groups, and all of them she had money in accounts the prosecutors hadn't found, lawyers who visited weekly, and a reputation that preceded her through these walls like perfume. The other colored women watched her with mixture of admiration and resentment. She hadn't come up through their world of domestic service and factory work. She'd built something, owned something, commanded respect from men who thought women were good for cooking and bed warming and not much else. You think you're special, don't you? The voice came from behind her, sharp with manufactured aggression. Stephanie didn't turn immediately. She recognized the speaker without looking. Dolores Murphy, a thick-shouldered Irish woman from Hell's Kitchen, in for stabbing her pimp with a broken bottle. Murphy ran a small protection racket inside, collecting cigarettes and commissary items from the weaker inmates. I don't think it, darling, Stephanie replied, her accent still carrying traces of French Creole after 2 decades in New York. I know it. She turned slowly, meeting Murphy's pale blue eyes with the steady gaze that had stared down Dutch Schultz himself. Just as I know you're about to make a decision that will change the rest of your time here. Murphy's face reddened. 2 other white women flanked her, Gladys and Pearl, small-timers who'd attached themselves to Murphy's dominance like remoras to a shark. The day room had gone quiet. Even the guards by the door had straightened, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded violence. You colored girls need to learn your place, Murphy said, her voice carrying across the room. My father worked the docks 30 years, broke his back so people like you could come here and take what's ours. Stephanie stood slowly, unfolding her height, 5'9" in bare feet, taller than Murphy by 3 inches. Her movements were deliberate, economical, the product of dance lessons in Port-au-Prince when she was a girl, before her family's money ran out. Your father's back broke because men like Dutch Schultz owned the unions and skimmed the pension funds, she said quietly. I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Murphy. I'm just someone who refused to know her place, as you put it, and that terrifies you. The psychology of confrontation Stephanie had learned was 90% theater. Murphy needed to save face in front of her followers. Back down now and she'd lose the small empire she'd built collecting tribute from frightened women. Push forward and she'd have to follow through on the implicit threat, risking injury or additional charges. Stephanie had given her an out, redirect the anger toward the real oppressors, the men in suits who exploited them all. But she could see in Murphy's eyes that pride would win over sense. I think you need a lesson, Murphy said, her hands curling into fists. Somebody needs to show you what happens when you forget you're just another. Choose your next word carefully, Stephanie interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried further than shouting, because whatever comes out of your mouth will determine whether you leave this room on your feet or on a stretcher. The threat hung in the air between them, tangible as humidity. Stephanie had fought before street fights in Harlem when rivals tried to muscle in on her territory, defending herself against men who thought a woman's business was there for the taking. She'd learned to fight from a numbers runner named Ignacio, who'd learned in the Cuban army, aim for the vulnerable places, move fast, never ever hesitate once the decision is made. But this wasn't just about fighting. This was about establishing a principle, drawing a line that would hold for however many months or years she'd be in this place. Let Murphy win, and every other woman looking for status would test her, stand firm, and she'd have peace, or at least the grudging respect that passed for peace behind bars. Murphy's hand moved towards Stephanie's face, a testing shove to see if she'd flinch. Stephanie caught the wrist mid-motion, her grip iron firm from years of counting money and signing papers and refusing to show weakness to men who wanted her to fail. She held Murphy's wrist at an angle that forced the larger woman onto her toes, a pain compliance hold Ignacio had taught her. "Last chance," Stephanie said. "Walk away. We'll both forget this happened." Murphy's other hand swung wide, a looping punch aimed at Stephanie's temple. The fight had begun. Stephanie released Murphy's wrist and stepped inside the wild punch, letting it glance off her shoulder while her own fist drove into Murphy's solar plexus. The Irish woman's breath exploded outward in a shocked grunt, but she was street tough, raised on tenement violence and Depression-era desperation. She recovered faster than Stephanie expected, wrapping thick arms around Stephanie's waist and driving forward with the momentum of a woman 20 pounds heavier. They crashed into the table, scattering the few women who'd been sitting there. Stephanie's hip struck the table edge, pain radiating down her leg, but she used the impact to pivot, throwing Murphy off balance. They went down together onto the concrete floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. Stephanie's mind remained coldly analytical. Even as her body fought, Murphy fought like a brawler, all strength and aggression. Stephanie fought like someone who'd studied the geometry of violence, who understood leverage and weak points and the psychology of dominance. "Guards," someone shouted, but the guards by the door made no move to intervene. Not yet. They were letting it play out, curious to see how the high and mighty Harlem queen would handle herself in a real prison fight. Stephanie registered this with part of her mind. The guards were complicit, had maybe even encouraged Murphy, wanted to see the colored woman who thought she was better than everyone else get humbled. Murphy's fingers clawed at Stephanie's face, nails raking across her cheek. Stephanie turned her head, felt the hot sting of torn skin, tasted blood in her mouth where her lips split against her teeth. She brought her knee up hard into Murphy's thigh, aiming for the nerve cluster that would deaden the leg. Murphy howled and rolled, trying to pin Stephanie beneath her bulk. "That all you got, Queenie?" Murphy panted, her face inches from Stephanie's, breath hot and sour. "All that money didn't teach you how to fight worth a damn." Stephanie didn't waste breath on words. She drove the heel of her palm upward into Murphy's nose, not hard enough to break it. She wasn't trying to kill the woman, but enough to bring tears and confusion. Murphy reared back, hands going to her face, and Stephanie bucked her off, rolling free and staggering to her feet. The circle of watching women had grown. 40 inmates ringed them now, some shouting encouragement, others watching with the blank-faced detachment of people who'd seen too much violence to be moved by more. Gladys and Pearl looked uncertain, wanting to help Murphy, but afraid of Stephanie's cold competence. The colored women stood together near the back, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes holding something that might have been hope or might have been fear that hope would be crushed again. Murphy came up fast, surprisingly agile for her size. This time she came with a weapon. She'd grabbed a metal cup from the floor, probably knocked from a table when they first collided. She swung it at Stephanie's head in a wide arc. Stephanie ducked under it, felt the air displacement as it passed over her hair, and came up inside Murphy's guard again. "You don't know when to quit," Murphy snarled, and there was something desperate in her voice now, the realization that this wasn't going the way she'd expected. She'd thought she'd overwhelmed the older woman quickly, established dominance, maybe rough her up enough to send a message without doing real damage. But Stephanie wasn't folding. Stephanie was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to submit. "I built an empire in Harlem," Stephanie said quietly, circling now, keeping Murphy turning. "You think I did that by quitting?" She feinted left, watched Murphy commit her weight, then drove a straight right hand into the hinge of Murphy's jaw. The Irish woman's head snapped back, eyes losing focus for a moment. That's when the guards finally moved. Or more accurately, that's when the plan revealed itself. 3 guards converged, not to separate them, but to target Stephanie specifically. The largest guard, a bull-necked man named Queenie, who'd made his prejudices clear since her first day, grabbed Stephanie from behind, pinning her arms. Murphy, recovering from the punch, saw her opportunity and charged forward. The first blow caught Stephanie in the stomach, driving the air from her lungs. Murphy hit her again and again, fist pumping into Stephanie's midsection while Queenie held her immobile. The watching inmates shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a fair fight anymore. This was an execution. "Enough," someone shouted. But Murphy was lost in the rhythm of violence now, taking out every frustration and humiliation, every slight and insecurity on Stephanie's body. A punch caught Stephanie's ribs and she felt something crack, the sharp crystalline pain of bone giving way. Another blow to her face reopened the cuts Murphy's nails had made, blood streaming freely now. Through the pain and the roaring in her ears, Stephanie's mind remained alert. They wanted her broken, not just physically, but spiritually. They wanted to destroy the woman who defied Dutch Schultz, who'd built power in a world that tried to deny her existence, who refused to accept that being colored and female meant accepting whatever scraps the powerful chose to throw. This beating was about more than prison hierarchy. It was about putting her back in the place society had designated for women like her. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of begging. Murphy's fist drove into Stephanie's face, and she felt her consciousness waver, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. She tasted blood, felt it running down her throat, warm and copper bright. Another blow, this one to her temple, and the world tilted sideways. Queenie's grip loosened, and she slumped forward, her legs no longer able to hold her weight. "That's enough, Murphy," Queenie said, his voice casual like he was commenting on the weather. "Don't kill her, just wanted to teach her some manners." Stephanie's knees hit the concrete, the impact barely registering through the symphony of pain conducting through her body. She looked up through swelling eyes and saw the faces surrounding her. Murphy breathing hard, knuckles bloody, Queenie smirking with satisfaction. The other inmates, some horrified, some satisfied, all complicit in their silence. She tried to speak, to say something defiant that would rob them of their victory, but her mouth wouldn't form the words. Blood bubbled between her lips instead. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a colored woman in the back of the crowd, tears streaming down her face, mouthing two words, "I'm sorry." Consciousness returned in fragments, each one bringing a new dimension of pain. First, the throbbing in her head, a pulsing agony that seemed to originate behind her eyes and radiate outward through her skull. Then the sharp, stabbing pain in her ribs with each shallow breath. Her face felt swollen, alien, the skin stretched tight over fluid and damaged tissue. She tried to open her eyes fully, but only her left eye would cooperate. The right remained sealed shut, the lid too swollen to lift. The infirmary smelled of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and rotten that she couldn't identify. She was lying on a metal cot with a thin mattress, a rough blanket pulled up to her chest. Through her working eyes, she could see peeling green paint on the walls, a single barred window high up near the ceiling, and a desk where a nurse sat writing in a ledger, her back to Stephanie. "She's awake," a voice said from somewhere to Stephanie's left. She tried to turn her head toward the sound and immediately regretted it, pain lancing through her neck and skull. A guard she didn't recognize, younger than Queenie, with a patchy mustache and uncertain eyes, stood against the wall, watching her with what might have been sympathy or might have been curiosity. The nurse turned, revealing a tired face with deep lines around the mouth. She was in her 50s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. She approached the bed with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen too many broken bodies to be moved by one more. "You're lucky to be alive," the nurse said, checking Stephanie's pulse with cool professional fingers. 3 cracked ribs, possible concussion, extensive bruising and lacerations. "Your jaw isn't broken, but it was close." Stephanie tried to speak, managed only a croak. The nurse held a cup of water to her lips, tipping it carefully. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it soothed her throat enough to form words. "So long," she whispered. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours," the nurse replied, making notes on a chart. "It's past midnight now. The warden will want to see you in the morning." She paused, something flickering across her face. Was it pity? No, something more complex. "Mrs. St. Clair, I need to document your injuries. The official report says you instigated a fight with another inmate, attacked her without provocation, and were subdued by guards intervening to protect her. Do you have anything to say about that?" Through the fog of pain, Stephanie's mind sharpened. Of course, the official narrative would paint her as the aggressor. Murphy would claim self-defense. Queenie and the other guards would corroborate. The system would close ranks around itself, protecting its own, ensuring that the colored woman who'd gotten too big for her britches would face maximum consequences. "The truth?" Stephanie managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or what you want to hear." The nurse's pen hesitated over the chart. For a moment their eyes met, and Stephanie saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. This woman knew. She'd seen the pattern before, documented the injuries that told stories contradicting official reports, watched as the machinery of institutional violence ground away at human dignity while maintaining the fiction of order and justice. "I'll write what you tell me," the nurse said quietly, "but I can't promise it will matter." "Then write this," Stephanie said, each word costing her. "Murphy attacked me. Guard Queenie held me while she beat me. I never had a chance to defend myself." She paused, gathering strength. "And write that I'll remember every person who watched and did nothing." The nurse nodded slowly and made her notes. When she finished, she applied fresh bandages to Stephanie's face with gentle hands. "Try to sleep," she said. "You're going to need your strength for what comes next." What came next arrived at 7 in the morning when Queenie himself appeared with another guard to escort Stephanie to the warden's office. They didn't offer help as she struggled to sit up, to swing her legs over the side of the cot. Every movement was agony, her ribs screaming protest, her head swimming with vertigo. She gripped the edge of the cot and forced herself to stand, refused to show weakness even as her vision darkened at the edges. The walk through the prison corridors felt endless. Inmates stared as she passed, some with satisfaction, others with fear, a few with something that might have been respect for the fact that she was still standing at all. She kept her back straight, her head up. Even though it felt like her skull might split open with each step, they wanted to see her broken. She would die before giving them that satisfaction. Warden Patterson's office was surprisingly pleasant. Wood paneling, curtained windows, photographs of his family on the desk. He was a small man with round spectacles and thinning hair, the kind of bureaucrat who'd risen through the system by never making waves, never challenging authority, never seeing inmates as anything but problems to be managed. Mrs. St. Clair, he said, not inviting her to sit. Or should I say, Miss? I understand you prefer not to use your husband's name. He shuffled papers on his desk, not looking at her. You've been here less than 2 months, and already you're causing serious problems. Attacking another inmate, creating a disturbance, refusing to follow the rules and hierarchy of this institution. That's not what happened, Stephanie said, her voice stronger now despite the pain. I was attacked. I was held while another inmate beat me. Your guards participated. Patterson finally looked up, his expression one of practiced patience dealing with a difficult child. Mrs. Murphy has extensive injuries to her hands and face, consistent with defending herself from an attack. 3 guards witnessed you initiating the altercation. The evidence is quite clear. Murphy's injuries are from hitting me, Stephanie replied. My injuries are from her beating me while I was restrained. Look at my wrists. You'll see bruising from where Carney held me. Patterson glanced at her wrists, saw the dark purple marks, and looked away. Restraint was necessary to prevent you from continuing your attack, he said smoothly. Mrs. St. Clair, I'm going to be frank with you. Your reputation precedes you. You ran illegal gambling operations in Harlem. You associated with criminals. You thought yourself above the law. That may have worked on the outside where you could corrupt police and politicians, but in here you're just another inmate, and inmates who can't control themselves face consequences. He opened a drawer and pulled out a form, signed it with a flourish. 30 days in solitary confinement effective immediately. Perhaps isolation will give you time to reflect on your behavior and your attitude. Solitary, the whole, the punishment that broke minds and spirits, that turned time into a meaningless cycle of darkness and silence. Stephanie had heard stories from other inmates, women who'd emerged from solitary, changed, diminished their defiance, crushed under the weight of absolute isolation. You're punishing me for being attacked, she said quietly. I'm maintaining order, Patterson replied. Take her to segregation. The solitary cell was 6 feet by 8 feet, concrete walls and floor, a metal bunk bolted to the wall with a thin mattress, a toilet in the corner with no seat, a small slot in the door for food delivery. The only light came from a single bulb in the corridor outside, filtered through a tiny window in the door. When the guards locked her in and walked away, the silence descended like a physical presence, pressing against her eardrums, filling her lungs. Stephanie stood in the center of the cell, taking inventory. Her body was damaged but functional. Her mind was clear, focused by pain rather than dulled by it. They had taken her freedom, beaten her body, isolated her from human contact, but they hadn't taken what mattered most, her sense of self, her dignity, her unshakable conviction that she was worth more than the world's attempts to diminish her. She sat carefully on the bunk, each movement deliberate and controlled. The pain in her ribs was constant, but she'd learned long ago that pain was just information, not a command. She could feel it, acknowledge it, and still function. She closed her working eye and began to breathe slowly and deeply despite the protest from her damaged ribs. In through the nose, out through the mouth, counting the breaths, anchoring herself in the present moment rather than the claustrophobic future stretching ahead. 30 days, 720 hours. 43,200 minutes. She would count every one if she had to. She would mark time in the rhythms of her body, heartbeats, breaths, the slow healing of tissue and bone. She would turn this cell from a punishment into a monastery, a place of contemplation and renewal. They thought they were breaking her. They were forging her into something harder. The first 3 days were the hardest. Her body demanded rest to heal, but sleep came in fractured intervals, interrupted by pain that flared whenever she shifted position. The darkness was never complete. The dim bulb in the corridor created a perpetual twilight that disoriented her circadian rhythms. She couldn't tell if hours had passed or merely minutes. Time became elastic, meaningless, a concept that belonged to the world outside this concrete box. But Stephanie had survived worse than darkness and silence. She'd survived grinding poverty in Martinique after her family's fortune evaporated. She'd survived arriving in New York with nothing, working as a seamstress for pennies, while men dismissed her dreams as the delusions of an immigrant woman who didn't know her place. She'd survived building a business in a world that wanted to destroy her for the crime of succeeding, while black and female. On the 4th day, when the worst of the swelling in her face had subsided and she could open both eyes, she began to impose structure on the void. She divided each day into segments, each with its purpose. Morning, when the slot opened and breakfast arrived, usually cold oatmeal or bread with weak coffee, was for physical inventory. She would examine her injuries, testing range of motion, cataloging improvements. The ribs hurt less when she breathed. The cuts on her face were scabbing over, itching as they healed. Her jaw worked properly, though chewing remained painful. Mid-morning was for exercise adapted to her limitations. She couldn't do the calisthenics she'd done in the general population, but she could move. She walked the perimeter of the cell, 6 feet turn, 8 feet turn, 6 feet turn, 8 feet, back and forth, counting steps. 500 steps, 1,000, 2,000. Movement kept her body functional and her mind occupied. She breathed deeply despite the rib pain, forcing her lungs to expand, refusing to let injured tissue stiffen into permanent limitation. The afternoon was for mental exercise. She had no books, no paper, no pencil, so she wrote in her mind. She composed letters to her lawyers, detailing everything that had happened, creating a record that existed only in memory but was no less real for that. She reconstructed her financial records from before her arrest, reviewing numbers and accounts, checking her mental calculations, ensuring that the empire she'd built wouldn't crumble in her absence. Her lieutenants in Harlem knew what to do, but she needed to stay sharp, ready to reclaim control when she got out. She thought about Dutch Schultz, the pale-eyed gangster who'd tried to muscle in on her territory. He'd wanted to absorb her operation into his own, offering a pittance for what she'd built. When she refused, he'd used his connections, judges, prosecutors, police captains on his payroll to have her arrested on charges that barely made sense, conspiracy to violate the state lottery laws, as if the numbers game was any different from the stock market gambling that made white men rich. But Schultz had underestimated her. He thought putting her in prison would break her organization, scatter her people, leave her territory ripe for takeover. He didn't understand that she'd built something more than a criminal enterprise. She'd built a community, a network of loyalty based on mutual respect and fair dealing. Her runners weren't just employees, they were partners, stakeholders in a system that treated them with dignity the white world denied them. Evening after the dinner slot opened, usually beans or thin soup with more bread, was for philosophy and reflection. Stephanie had been educated in Catholic schools in Martinique, had read Voltaire and Rousseau, had absorbed lessons about justice and human rights that the nuns probably hadn't intended. She thought about power and its exercise, about the difference between authority and legitimacy. The warden had authority. He could lock her in this cell, deny her food, punish her body, but he had no legitimacy in her eyes. She hadn't consented to his power. She didn't recognize his moral right to judge her. The guards who'd held her while Murphy beat her, the warden who'd blamed her for being attacked, the system that had convicted her on false charges, they all operated from the same principle. They believed in a hierarchy where some people mattered and others didn't, where white people had inherent rights and colored people had only what they were permitted. Stephanie had spent her adult life refusing that principle. She would not start accepting it now. On the 7th day, she heard voices in the corridor outside her cell, guard voices discussing her. Warden says check on her, make sure she's not dead, one said, voice muffled by the door. She's tough, this one, another replied. That sounded like the young guard from the infirmary. Murphy broke her hand, hitting her 3 bones. Doc says she won't be throwing punches for months. Good, maybe both of them learned something. The slot opened and a face appeared, the young guard, his eyes searching the dim interior. You alive in there, St. Clair? Very much so, Stephanie replied from where she sat cross-legged on the bunk, her back against the wall. Her voice was steady, calm, showing none of the rage that burned in her chest. The guard studied her for a moment. Do you need anything? Medical attention? I need justice, Stephanie said, but I don't expect you to provide that. The slot closed, the voices moved away, but something had shifted. They were checking on her because they were worried, not about her welfare, about what she might do, what she might become in this darkness. They'd meant to break her. Instead, they'd given her time to think, to plan, to forge her anger into something cold and purposeful. By the 2nd week, her body had largely healed. The ribs still ached, but she could breathe deeply without gasping. The bruises had faded from purple-black to yellow-green, her face returning to its normal proportions. She increased her exercise regimen, doing modified push-ups against the wall, squats, stretches that kept her muscles functional. She was 55 years old, but she would not let this cell age her into weakness. By the 3rd week, she'd created an entire routine that filled her days with purpose. She woke when the breakfast slot opened, exercised for 2 hours, spent the middle of the day in meditation and mental calculation, exercised again in the afternoon, and spent evenings composing speeches in her mind, speeches she would give someday somewhere about dignity and resistance and the refusal to be diminished. She thought about the women in the general population, especially the colored women who'd watched her being beaten. She didn't blame them for not intervening. What could they have done against guards in the prison hierarchy? But she would not forget that moment when the system's violence was laid bare, when everyone saw exactly how power maintained itself. On the 25th day, she heard different sounds in the corridor, footsteps that stopped at her door, the jangle of keys, the slot opening. The nurse from the infirmary peered in. Mrs. St. Clair, I'm here to check on you before you're released back to general population, she said. "May I come in?" The door opened and the nurse entered with a guard standing watch in the doorway. She examined Stephanie quickly and efficiently, checking her healing injuries, looking into her eyes, testing her reflexes. Finally, she stepped back, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Remarkable," she said quietly. "Most inmates emerge from 30 days in solitary diminished. You look stronger than when you went in." "That's because I am," Stephanie replied. "They meant this as punishment. I made it a retreat." The nurse nodded slowly. "The warden will see you tomorrow morning before you return to your cell block. He'll want to assess your attitude, determine if you've learned your lesson." "Oh, I've learned," Stephanie said, "just not the lesson he intended." That night, her last in solitary, Stephanie allowed herself to feel the emotions she'd kept carefully controlled for 29 days. The rage at injustice, the grief for her stolen freedom, the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting a system designed to crush people like her. She felt it all, acknowledged it, and then let it flow through her and away. She would not carry bitterness back into the world. Bitterness corroded from within, turned people into victims. She would carry something else: clarity, purpose, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. She thought about Queenie Stephanie St. Clair, the girl from Martinique who'd come to America chasing dreams. She thought about Madame St. Clair, the numbers banker who'd built an empire in Harlem. And she thought about who she was becoming in this concrete cell, someone who discovered that no external power could touch what mattered most. They could imprison her body, beat it, isolate it, but her mind, her spirit, her essential self remained free. Tomorrow she would return to the general population. Murphy would be there, hand in a cast, watching to see if the beating had broken her. Kearney would be there, ready to punish any sign of defiance. The other inmates would be watching too, wondering if Queenie had survived or if all that remained was a hollow shell wearing her face. She would show them all who Stephanie St. Clair really was. The morning sun hurt her eyes when she finally stepped out of the segregation wing. 30 days in twilight had left her light sensitive, but she refused to squint or shield her face. She walked with her head high, following the guard through corridors that seemed impossibly bright and loud after the silence of solitary. Inmates moved past, their voices a cacophony after weeks of hearing only her own thoughts. Some stared. Most looked away quickly, uncertain how to react to her return. Warden Patterson sat behind his desk with the same practiced expression of mild disapproval. He gestured to the chair across from him, a small concession she hadn't been offered at their last meeting. Stephanie sat carefully, her posture perfect despite the lingering ache in her ribs. "Mrs. St. Clair," Patterson began, folding his hands on the desk, "I trust your time in solitary confinement has given you opportunity for reflection. This institution has rules, a hierarchy, an order that must be maintained. Do you understand that now?" Stephanie met his gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly, Warden. I understand that power protects itself. I understand that injustice wears the mask of order. I understand that you can imprison my body, but nothing else." She paused, let the words sink in. "And I understand that history will remember who stood for dignity and who enforced brutality in the name of peace." Patterson's jaw tightened. "That sounds remarkably like the same attitude that landed you in segregation." "With respect, Warden, what landed me in segregation was being attacked while your guards held me down. The attitude you object to is simply my refusal to pretend otherwise." Stephanie leaned forward slightly. "I will follow your rules. I will cause no trouble. But I will not lie about what happened, and I will not accept blame for being brutalized." For a long moment, Patterson said nothing. Then he sighed suddenly, looking older, more tired. "You're being released from this facility in 4 months, Mrs. St. Clair. Your sentence is nearly complete. I suggest you spend that time quietly preparing to re-enter society. What you do on the outside is no concern of mine, but while you're here, I expect compliance." "You'll have it," Stephanie said, "but compliance is not the same as submission. I hope you understand the difference." She was escorted back to the general population wing during lunch when most inmates were in the dining hall. The guard opened her old cell. She'd been assigned a different cellmate during her absence, a young Puerto Rican woman named Carmen who looked terrified when Stephanie entered. "Don't worry," Stephanie said gently in Spanish, drawing on the linguistic skills she developed in Harlem's polyglot streets. "I'm not here to cause problems. I just want to serve my time in peace." Carmen relaxed slightly, managed a small smile. "They say you're Queenie. They say you ran all of Harlem." "I ran a business," Stephanie corrected. "I employed people, paid them fairly, and treated them with respect. The fact that my business happened to be illegal doesn't change that I ran it with integrity." That afternoon, when she entered the day room for the first time since the beating, conversation stopped. Every head turned. Murphy sat at her usual table, her right hand encased in a cast from wrist to fingertips, her face bearing fading bruises of her own. Their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them, not reconciliation, but understanding. They'd both paid a price for that fight. They'd both survived. Stephanie walked to an empty table near the window and sat down, claiming neither the white section nor the colored section, occupying neutral territory. She had no book, no activity, nothing but herself and the sunlight streaming through the bars. She closed her eyes and simply breathed, feeling the space around her, the presence of other people, the sounds and smells of communal existence after 30 days of isolation. Queenie, the voice was soft, hesitant. Stephanie opened her eyes to find three colored women standing nearby, the same women who'd watched her beating, who'd been unable or unwilling to intervene. The speaker was the one who'd mouthed, "I'm sorry," as Stephanie lost consciousness. Her name was Ruth. Stephanie remembered in for passing bad checks. "May we sit?" Ruth asked. Stephanie gestured to the empty chairs. The three women sat, not quite meeting her eyes, their posture defensive. "We wanted to say," Ruth began, then stopped, struggling for words. "We wanted you to know we're sorry for not helping, for just watching." "What could you have done?" Stephanie asked, her voice gentle. "Attacked the guards? Gotten yourselves beaten or killed? There were dozens of us and only three of them, but they had the guns, the authority, the system behind them. Your survival is not something to apologize for." "But you fought back," another woman said, Lorraine, doing time for prostitution. "Even knowing you'd lose, you fought." "I fought because I'm 55 years old and I fought my entire life," Stephanie replied. "I fought because I built something in the world and I know my worth, but each of you has to find your own way. Resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it's standing up and swinging. Sometimes it's enduring, surviving, refusing to let them make you believe you're less than you are." They talked for an hour, these women who'd been invisible to each other before, separated by the prison's unspoken social codes. They talked about their lives before incarceration, the circumstances that had brought them here, the families they'd left behind. Stephanie listened more than she spoke, understanding that what they needed was not her wisdom, but her presence, the validation that came from someone who'd refused to be broken, treating them as equals worth hearing. Over the following weeks, more women approached her, white women, Jewish women, Italian women, colored women, not all at once, not in any organized way, but gradually, carefully testing to see if the stories they'd heard were true. Was she really the woman who'd told Dutch Schultz to go to hell? Had she really run a numbers operation that paid out honestly when most were rigged? Had she really emerged from 30 days in solitary stronger instead of broken? Stephanie answered their questions honestly, shared her story without embellishment, and listened to theirs in return. She discovered that nearly every woman in that prison had a story of being brutalized by the system, beaten by police, raped by judges who promised leniency, coerced into plea bargains for crimes they didn't commit, or simply ground down by poverty and limited options until crime seemed like the only choice. She didn't try to organize them or build another empire. That wasn't what this was about. But she did offer something perhaps more valuable, the example of dignity maintained in the face of degradation, of selfhood preserved despite all attempts to erase it. She showed them that it was possible to be imprisoned without being defeated, to be knocked down without being broken. Murphy kept her distance for 3 weeks. Then one afternoon, as Stephanie sat reading a battered copy of Dumas that someone had lent her, the Irish woman approached. She stood there silently until Stephanie looked up. "My hand's never going to work right," Murphy said without preamble, holding up the casted appendage. "Doc says I broke it in 3 places hitting you. Bones didn't set proper." "I'm sorry," Stephanie said, and meant it. "Don't be. I came at you. You defended yourself." "Well, until Carney grabbed you." Murphy shifted her weight, uncomfortable. "That wasn't right what they did. Holding you like that, I thought it was going to be a fair fight. Prove who was toughest, you know. But they made it into something else. They made it into a message," Stephanie said quietly. "For everyone watching, this is what happens when you don't know your place." Murphy nodded slowly. Yeah, I get that now." She paused. "For what it's worth, you were right. My father's back broke because the bosses stole his pension, not because of you. I just needed someone to blame, and you were there acting like you owned the place." "I acted like I owned myself," Stephanie corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Murphy asked, genuinely curious. "All the difference in the world," Stephanie replied. "Owning a place means controlling others. Owning yourself means no one else controls you." Murphy stood there a moment longer, then nodded and walked away. They would never be friends, but the violence between them had ended. In its place was something like mutual respect, the acknowledgement that they both survived an ordeal and emerged changed. As Stephanie's release date approached, she found herself thinking about what came next. Her business in Harlem would have changed in her absence. Dutch Schultz would have made moves. Other operators would have grabbed territory. Her runners would have adapted or scattered. She'd need to assess the situation carefully, rebuild what had been damaged, reclaim what had been stolen. But she'd also been changed by this experience. 30 days in darkness had clarified things, burned away the non-essential, and left only what mattered. She'd built her empire on dignity, treating her employees fairly, paying out honestly, creating something that served her community rather than exploiting it. That foundation remained solid. Whatever came next, she would build on that foundation. The night before her release, Carmen asked her a question. Queenie, how do you do it? How do you stay strong when everything's trying to break you? Stephanie thought for a long moment before answering. You have to know who you are, she said finally. Not who the world says you are, not who you're supposed to be, but who you actually are at your core. They can take away everything external, your freedom, your money, your comfort, your safety. But if you know yourself, if you understand your own worth independent of what others think, they can't touch what matters most. But how do you know yourself, Carmen Prest? How do you figure that out? By testing yourself, Stephanie replied. By facing challenges that strip away all the pretense and leave only truth. Prison does that if you let it. Solitary does that. Being beaten and surviving does that. You learn that you're stronger than you thought, that you can endure more than you imagined, that your spirit is more resilient than any external force trying to crush it. She looked at the young woman, seeing in her face echoes of her own younger self, frightened, uncertain, but carrying within her the potential for greatness, if only she could believe it. You're stronger than you know, Carmen. Whatever brought you here, whatever happens next, remember that. The world will try to convince you you're weak, that you need to accept whatever scraps they offer, that your only value is in serving others. Don't believe it. You have infinite worth just because you exist. On the morning of January 15th, 1933, Stephanie St. Clair walked out of the Women's House of Detention wearing the same clothes she'd worn when she entered. They fit differently now. She'd lost weight, her body leaner and harder from exercise and inadequate food. But she walked differently, too, with a certainty that came from having been tested to her limits and discovering those limits were farther than anyone, including herself, had imagined. The winter air bit at her face, cold and clean and free. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, feeling the space around her extend in all directions rather than stop at concrete walls. A black car idled at the curb. Her lawyer had sent it. But before she got in, she turned and looked back at the prison, its gray walls and barred windows, the place where she'd been sent to be broken. She smiled, not with bitterness or irony, but with genuine satisfaction. They'd done their worst, and she'd survived. More than survived, she'd emerged with her dignity intact. Her sense of self strengthened, her understanding of power and resistance deepened. She'd learned that true freedom existed in the mind and spirit, that external circumstances could imprison the body, but never the essential self. She thought about the women still inside, Ruth and Lorraine and Carmen and even Murphy, all of them learning in their own ways that they were more than the world's attempt to diminish them. She thought about the battles ahead, the war to reclaim her territory from Dutch Schultz, the struggle to rebuild what had been damaged during her absence. But most of all, she thought about the lessons she would carry forward from this experience. Power that relied on violence and coercion was ultimately hollow. True power came from integrity, from treating people with dignity, from building something that served rather than exploited. She'd built her empire on that principle before. She would rebuild it on that principle now. Stephanie St. Clair got into the car and told the driver to take her to Harlem. She had work to do, a community to serve, and a legacy to build. They tried to break her. Instead, they'd forced her into something unbreakable. The car pulled away from the curb, carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind her, the prison receded into the distance. Ahead lay freedom, possibility, and the rest of her story, a story of resistance, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit's refusal to be conquered. She was Madame Stephanie St. Clair. She was Queenie. She was unbroken and unbreakable, and she was going home